If you'll join with me, sermon reading, John 8:28. We're going to see the context around this passage as well. But here's what Jesus speaks for us today, as John records it. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He. And I do nothing on my own, but I only speak what the Father has taught me." We're on this journey towards Easter. And on this journey toward Easter, we're looking at the 3 times Jesus says the Son of Man must be lifted up. Now, Son of Man was Jesus' favorite saying for himself and what he called himself and how he identified himself. And it was his connection to humanity, and that's why he calls himself the Son of Man. And we know that when Jesus says about being lifted up, he's talking about lifted up upon a cross for his death, but also the resurrection that follows. And so there's a double play on that word of speaking of his exaltation, his glorification that comes through it. Now, we've been looking at the context around these 3 statements, and they're powerful in helping us understand the cross, the power of the cross, and its implications within our lives, especially as Jesus followers. Now, we looked at chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where Jesus said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so I will be lifted up. And we looked through the facts that Jesus is talking about being a suffering symbol that's lifted up, and life and healing are going to flow to us because we believe and we look in faith upon that. And last week we saw God's amazing plan in the context that surrounded that statement. An amazing plan of being born again or born anew. About being given God's nature and a new nature put within us. And as we do so, it's there to empower us to live lives of righteousness, to do the things of love and good deeds and right behavior and kingdom activity, to be done with sin. And this week we're going to build on those last 2 weeks, and it's powerful as we look at God's desire to set us free from sin. And today could be an amazing day for us in our lives. God's desire to set us free from sin. And it's about God's empowerment through a new nature that He's given us as we're born anew. So the context of this passage in John chapter 8 is there's a lot to it. And I'm not going to read all of it, but a part of it that we have to understand, we start in about verse 12. And in verse 12, Jesus says, "I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me is not going to walk in darkness, but they're going to walk in the light of life." Light is about illumination. It's about truth and what God has given. So Jesus says, "I'm the light. I am the truth. I'm the one who's going to share with you the truth. And when you follow me and listen to what I'm saying, you're going to walk in that light and that illumination to the abundant life that God has for you." Jesus says, "I'm from the Father. And I'm giving you this truth, but you don't know the Father and you don't know me." So the big question comes up, and this is the big question, and this is what we're going to see throughout the rest of the message even, what Jesus is trying to explain. The question is this: who are you, Jesus? That's what they ask him. Who are you? That's a question people are still answering today. It's a question many people are still answering today. They're trying to figure out who is Jesus and figure out who is this person. Even beyond a person, God in the midst of this. See, Jesus doesn't answer the question immediately, but he says, "You will know who I am as I am lifted up. Then you will know that I am He." I am He. See, the cross is going to be the complete revelation of not only who Jesus is, but who God is, and God's revelation, and God's purpose, and God's plan, and God's truth. So when we get to chapter 8, verse 28, Jesus says, "When you've lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He." I think it should have been obvious. It should have been obvious like in Mark chapter 15, verse 38. We hear the story of Jesus being on the cross, and at the moment of his crucifixion and death, an earthquake comes and shakes everything. Inside the temple, things are being destroyed in this earthquake, but from the very top to the bottom, there is a curtain that is there. And this curtain separates the holy place, the very place where the very presence of God is, from the rest of the world. And that curtain tears from the very top to the very bottom, saying there's a whole new way into the presence of God as Jesus is there and as he dies upon that cross. And the centurion who's in charge of this execution, he looks up and he says, "Surely this man is the Son of God." See, it should be that simple. We should see that. Jesus says, as you lift me up, you're going to know I am He. And yet, it's not always that easy. Jesus came to reveal the Father, and he revealed God most fully upon the cross and in the resurrection. See, for some of us, the cross is the proof. It's about life. It's about healing. It's about being set free. It's about the abundant life that we can live, and that's awesome because we believe. But for others, they don't believe. They simply choose not to believe. See, the cross and the resurrection still would not convince many people of Jesus' identity or of God the Father's plan. It reminds me of Luke chapter 16. In Luke chapter 16, there's an interesting parable that Jesus shares. And you might know this one, you might not. It's a parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Anybody ever heard this one before? Here's what Jesus shares in this, and we're supposed to get some truth out of this. He says there's a rich man who lives in wealth, and outside of his gates there's a poor beggar named Lazarus, okay? And what happens is they both die. Lazarus is taken to Abraham's bosom, and he's with Abraham in this place where the dead are being held. This place, they call it Hades, the place of the grave. And yet at the same time, this rich man dies, and he goes, but he's in a different area completely, separated by this gulf. And he's in a place not with Abraham, but he's in a place what he calls torment, separated from God. And he says, Abraham, please give me just a little bit of water here. And Abraham says, sorry, we can't cross that gulf. Once you're here, you're in your spot. There's no getting around that. And then he says something else that's very interesting. He says, but my family, my brothers, he says, you got to go warn them. And he says, no, that's okay. He says, they have Moses and the prophets. They don't need anything else. And he says, but no, if someone were to be raised from the dead, they would listen. And Abraham says, no, they have Moses and the prophets. And if they don't believe that, they're not even going to believe if someone is raised from the dead. Now, who do you think Jesus is talking about there? Jesus is saying, some people, I'm raised from the dead, they're not going to believe. It's not going to change. Because I'm here to fulfill the law and the prophets, Moses and the prophets. You see, the cross and the resurrection will be Jesus' vindication, proving it's true of all that he is and what he's come to do, the revealer of God and God's truth. And many people put their faith in Jesus right there and then. That's what it says. Many people put their faith in Jesus. Now, in this passage of John chapter 8, Jesus is speaking to a large crowd most of the time. But the people that put their faith in Jesus, Jesus has a small section where he speaks to them. And then again, it broadens out to this large crowd that he's speaking to again. And here's where he begins to say to those who believed in him. To those who believed, Jesus said, remain in my word. Hold on to my word, like you're holding on to a cliff for dear life. Hold on and remain in my word, and you will be my disciples. Adhere to my teaching. Let your lives be directed by it. Make this a way of life for you. It should be the rule of faith and practice. And when he says this, he says one of the most amazing things, if you hold to my word and remain in my word, you'll be my disciples. And he goes on to say, and then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Anybody ever heard that scripture before? It's a powerful statement that Jesus makes. See, false beliefs hold the world in bondage. They lead the world to bondage. But the truth sets one free. Jesus taught the truth. In fact, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, the life. I will lead you to this place. They immediately say to Jesus, as he says, you'll be set free. And they say, well, Jesus, we have never been enslaved before, which just cracks me up if you know the history of Israel. They don't even remember the time of Moses. Remember, they're in Egypt. They're slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. Remember that? Oh, we don't remember that time where we had to be set free. And then they don't remember then they were free for a little while, that Assyria comes in and wipes them out and they're in bondage. Babylon wipes them out. They're in bondage. Greeks have done this as well. And now the Romans are in control. They've hardly ever been out of bondage. Well, we've never been in bondage before. But that just shows us something. Sometimes we're in bondage in our lives and we do not know it. We don't recognize it, we don't see it, and yet God says, yes, you need to be set free. Set free. And then Jesus gets right to the point. In verses 34 through 36, Jesus says, truly, truly, I tell you the truth. Everyone who practices sin is a slave of sin. Everyone. And Jesus reminds them that there's really another type of bondage and slavery that's not social or economic or political. Sin is a slave master, and it puts you in bondage. And it is truly possible for a person to be enslaved and not even know it. So Jesus tries to help them understand with a common example from their culture. And as we hear this little parable that Jesus shares, this common example from the culture, we have to understand, here's what Jesus wants them to understand. It's about the authority of the Son to act and set free. Okay? Remember that. The authority of the Son to act and set free. And here's what Jesus says. He says, a slave has no permanent standing in a household. Now, in their day, the slavery, they lived in a system, a very odd system of being indebted to one another. Everybody was just indebted to one another. And what most slavery was about a person who was indebted to someone else. And they say, well, you know, you're indebted here. You owe me all this money. How are you going to pay this back? Well, I don't know. Well, you're going to be a slave here for 3 years. You can pay this thing off. And then, you see, it's this kind of thing that would take place. And so this is what Jesus is talking about. It's about debtors and paying off debts. But they're not a permanent part of the household. They could be bought. They could be sold. They could be traded away. All this can take place. But it's different with a son, Jesus says. A son has a place in the household as a right. And as a son comes of age, this son has the authority and can act under the full authority of the household because of his status there. And any decision that the son makes is permanent. Now, you see, Jesus wants to draw from this analogy. And remember, Jesus, his whole ministry was about setting people free. His whole ministry was about emancipation. It was about liberation, right? Jesus is saying, here's Jesus, the Son, okay? And he acts with supreme authority given to him from God the Father. And the Son can emancipate a slave, and that person will be truly free. Everybody understand what he's saying by that? Now he draws it into the spiritual. Jesus is trying to help them understand his authority over the things of this world, his power and authority over sin and its power. The sinner, anybody here ever sinned before? Am I the only one, or are we? Okay, we're all in this boat. So when we hear about the idea of the sinner, we know that's me and that's everyone, right? The sinner is enslaved by sin, but can be liberated under the power and the authority of the Son. Now, remember the question they asked Jesus? Who are you? The answer will be given as Jesus is lifted up upon the cross in his death and in his resurrection. Then you will know who I am and that I am he. I am the one with complete revelation of God and God's plan and God's purpose and God's truth. I am the Son of God who has complete authority over sin and over its power, and I can set you free. I have authority over the power of the enemy, over sin, over its curse, even where it leads to the point of death. That's why when John, later on in life, he's on this island called Patmos as he's been arrested, and he's in his 90s, and he's getting ready to die there. And Jesus gives him this great revelation. It's the last book of the Bible for us, called Revelation. And here's what Jesus says at the beginning. See, John sees him, and he says, I saw him, and I fell at his feet like I was dead. But he laid his hand on me, and he said, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and forever. And I hold the keys of death and of the grave. I have power and authority over all of this. See, here's the good news, folks. We don't have to be enslaved to sin in our lives. I'm just waiting for everybody to stand up and start cheering because that's good news. All right, everybody, wake up now. Come on. Jesus says, as I am lifted up, not only healing and life are going to flow to you, not only are you going to be born anew and born again, not only is God's nature going to be literally implanted in you, but it's empowering us to live a righteous life, to be done with sin. All that junk that is contrary to God and contrary to God's nature can be done. We can be set free. Understand this today, folks. You can be set free from burdens, from your past. You can be set free from addictions, from anger, from unforgiveness, from any attitudes and any sin that is holding you back from the fullness of life that God has for you and desires for you. Did everybody hear that? You need to jump up and down for that one, maybe? We need this, and we can have it. See, this must have been a powerful message for Jesus because he revealed it to Paul in a powerful way as well. See, he writes about this in really a strikingly similar way in Romans chapter 6, where we're talking about being set free. And Paul shares with us the real truth about the power of sin. And for Paul, sin is not just, it's not just an act or an attitude or a thought or a deed that's contrary to God or God's nature. And that's true, that's sin. But for Paul, it goes much deeper. It's almost in his writings, especially in the book of Romans, he literally personifies sin. And he personifies it in a way like in chapter 5:21 and 6:12, he calls it like sin is like a king with authority. And in chapter 6, verse 6, he calls it a slave master and an owner, someone it's personified. Even as you get to chapter 7, he talks about it as someone who can be dead or alive. He personifies it as this powerful, powerful thing. You know, as F.F. Bruce put it this way, sin is an external power alien to humanity's true nature as God intended. It's an enemy that has invaded humanity. It has occupied us and it holds us captive. The world apart from Christ is under sin's control. Jesus' work was to attack sin on its own ground and defeat it. The person that is in Christ is connected to Jesus and now enters into Jesus' victory that was won and can be delivered and is delivered from sin's tyranny and power. See, as a believer, as we're born anew and born again, Paul shares with us that we are so connected to Jesus that we join him in his death and resurrection. That's a powerful statement that Paul makes. And that's what we're going to hear about in John chapter 6. I mean, it reminds me of Paul as he writes in Galatians 2:20, I've been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but now it's Christ who lives in me. We understand we died to one thing, we're living in something new. I'm going to read to you Romans 6, part of it. And I want you to hear the power of what it means to be dead to sin and alive to God now. Everybody ready? Listen to this like you've never heard it. Maybe you've never heard it before, but listen to this like you've never heard this before. You can even just close your eyes and think about it if you want. One time a pastor is going to tell you can close your eyes during the sermon, but you have to open up immediately after. No, I'm just kidding. But Romans chapter 6. Now listen to this. I'm going to be reading 6 through 14 and then 17 and 18. Here's what Paul writes. We know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ so that sin might lose its power in our lives. Everybody hear that? That's awesome. We're no longer slaves to sin. For when we died with Christ, we were set free from the power of sin. And since we died with Christ, we know that we will also live with him. We're sure of this because Christ was raised from the dead, and he's never going to die again. Death no longer has any power over him. When he died once to break the very power of sin. But now that he lives for the very glory of God. So you also should consider yourselves dead to the power of sin and alive to God through Jesus Christ. That's who we are called to be. He goes deeper. Do not let sin control the way that you live. Do not give in to sinful desires. Do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourself completely to God, for you are dead, but now you have a new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the very glory of God, because sin no longer is your master. You no longer live under the requirements of the law. Instead, you now live under the freedom of God's grace. Thank God. Once you were slaves to sin, but now you wholeheartedly obey Jesus' teaching and that he's given and that we have given to you. Now you are free from your slavery to sin, and now you've become slaves to righteous living. That's you. That's us. That's who we are called to be. As the Son of Man is lifted up, you'll know I am he, the one who will set you free. from sin. Amen. No longer an old master. We now have a new one, a new owner who loves us, who liberates us and gives us abundant life. So if the Son sets you free, you are truly free indeed. See, Jesus has won this victory. Now, part of that victory is personal deliverance within our lives. Jesus won this victory, but the victory is really in this spiritual realm out here. Now, the trick for us is learn how to take that victory and learn to apply it within our lives, translate it into the place of our everyday living. And although the victory's won, sin is always there trying to reassert its old authority and its old power, but we have the power to close the door against it. And it has no right in our lives. I say this because today could be the day that sets your life on a completely different course. Today could be the day when you begin walking in the victory Jesus won upon the cross like you've never done in your lives before. Today, you could find healing and liberation and freedom from bondage and burdens and addictions. Anybody here need that? Today is the day. I mean, the two very points that Paul tries to share with us in Romans 6 are, number one, you are now God's possession and you have a whole new master that's leading us toward righteousness. And number two, with Christ, you have died to sin and it has no power or authority over you unless you allow it. We now have a new nature to lead us and guide us. See, God's amazing because if He sets us free from one thing, He sets us free to do something else. And if He sets us free from sin, He sets us free to live the way we're called to live. So here's how we do it. Trying to break it down to make it as real as we can for us. In our lives, okay, I've got garbage, I've got addiction, I've got this, I've got that. All these things that are there, and it's constantly there. We don't want it there, but it's just constantly there. How can we be set free from it? Here it is. Number one, recognize God's victory in Jesus. See it for what it is and recognize it. Number two, recognize that God has put His very nature and spirit living within you. And then number three, begin to walk in that Spirit's power to your victory. See how that works? That's how it's all connected. What God wants to give us, it's there, and He will help us conquer it because we die to sin and live for righteousness. See, in Jesus we've died, and now we live for God. And like Romans 6:4, just as Christ was raised from the dead to the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life.